Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is one of my oldest inks, from back in the day when this was my jam. I absolutely loved quills, and God, I was nerdy. Anyways, it's Diamine's Mediterranean Blue. And as you might be able to tell, despite the fact that this is probably up there with my oldest inks, it's mostly full. And that's because it's just a little too light for me. But, yeah, all the tests were done in this MonteVerde Impressa with a 1.1 stub. And this Waterman Hemisphéré with an extremely fine nib. It's unmarked. I think it's fine, but I'm pretty sure it's extra fine by pretty much compared to all my other pens. Now, here's Mediterranean Blue compared with all of my other Diamine blues. So Sapphire, Bilberry, Presidential Blue, Asa Blue, Florida Blue, Denim, Sargasso, Kensington, Midnight, Blue Black, Teal, Prussian Blue, Indigo Blue, Majestic Blue, and if you look at this, you can see just how pale and thin this is compared to all these other inks. And it's just a little too weak for me, but it's decent enough blue, and it is a personal preference. It's just not my ideal. And I also found something from not quite as far back in the day, but a bit further back in the day. When I was first doing paper tests, here I did a paper test with, these are pretty much all Knox pens, and extra fine, fine, medium, broad, and a 1.1 stub. And yeah, as you can see, it's a very light blue. It's very pale. And yeah, the dry times probably aren't going to match up, but yeah. And as you can see, not a lot of water resistance. But, yeah. Speaking of which, let's check out the chromatography. As you can probably see, there's this really pale, very thin light purple at the bottom, and then it goes up into a very thin, very pale blue up at the top. There's not a lot to this substantially, so meh. Top down in density, Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. As you can see in the stub, there's a decent amount of shading, but it's still very light and it's still pretty thin. And you still get some shading in the fine nib, but you know, it's a little harder to see because it's so darn fine. Yeah, and I mean, the dry time was cut in half, you know, between the stub and the extra fine nib, so no bleed feather spread. So there's echo in the most obscene part, so there. Yeah, I say it looks a little weak and watery, but yeah, really not much there. That's looking a bit darker on camera. But as you can see, in certain parts of the stub, it stayed, but mostly it's gone. So next is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. Here it definitely looks light and pretty thin. Yeah, it's yeah, this is too light for my comfort. Some people may be perfectly fine with it, but for me it's just too light. The really fine nib took 7 seconds, the stub took 16. Yeah, there is nice shading in both pens. But in part, I think it's because of how weak and watery the ink is, and that's sort of not worth it in my opinion. But yeah, the stub remained a bit better than the fine, but it's mostly gone. Next is Tomoe River Paper, where it looks really thin. It looks really watery. You do get some shading, and you do get some halo effect, as you might be able to see in the M in Mediterranean. And again, you get very pronounced shading, but it's, you know, And I said there's no bleed, but I put an asterisk because I was laying it on really heavy and it came through. 8 seconds to dry versus 19 seconds. This would tire my eyes if I had to read like a whole page of that. So that's why it really doesn't work for me, just because my eyes would get tired. But yeah, mostly gone. See, it started to come through. But that was me being an idiot. So here's 20-pound copier paper, where it's spread a good bit. The line looks much more broad on this absorbent paper, which I hope you can see. So, yeah. Anyways, there's bleed and feathering, which I said is sad considering how extremely fine this nib is. It has a woolly finish. I mean, the water test was okay, but, you know, it exploded and it feathered. And, again, this is the finest, tiniest nib that I own, and it still came through in parts. And next is Moleskine, sorry, Mead paper. My mistake. Dried almost instantly. I said the bleed could be worse, but for how fine this nib is, it really doesn't bode well. And it had trouble keeping up with the absorbency of the paper. Again, it gave it kind of a woolly finish, and it spread the line a little bit. Started to dye the page just a touch, which is coming out neon on my camera again. Jesus Christ. Anyways, mostly gone, kind of explodey, kind of bleedy. And lastly is Moleskine paper, where again, there's feathering and spread, and I see you get some shading remaining, but that's where you get the feathers. Because anywhere where there's enough ink to pool is where it starts to explode. So, really not a great showing, and it's still very light, and it's a bit weak looking. Water test is mostly gone. And again, for how absolutely tiny this nib is, that is a great deal of bleed. So there you go for your consideration. Diamine Mediterranean Blue. It's just too light for me, but it's a perfectly alright blue. It doesn't always behave well, but it behaves alright. So for your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching.